February 1943. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels declared total war to thunderous applause, promising final victory against the Bolshevik hordes. But beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a map room where the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and mounting dread, General Kurt Zeitzler stood before Adolf Hitler with a casualty report that made his hands tremble. The German Sixth Army had ceased to exist, not retreated, not regrouped, ceased to exist. 300,000 men had marched into Stalingrad the previous summer. 91,000 had just surrendered, half frozen and starving. The rest lay dead in the ruins of that shattered city on the Volga. Zeitzler had seen the Soviet strength estimates for the spring offensive. He knew what was coming. He just didn't yet know how to make his Führer understand that the numbers no longer worked, that the mathematics of this war had fundamentally changed, that Germany was now fighting an enemy it could not defeat. The recognition came slowly, unevenly, differently for each man in German high command. It arrived in stages, like a diagnosis you refuse to accept until the evidence becomes overwhelming. Some saw it at Stalingrad, others needed Kursk. A few deluded themselves until Soviet tanks rolled through Poland. But between February 1943 and January 1945, every general in the German military leadership went through the same terrible progression, from belief in victory to hope for stalemate, to desperate attempts to merely survive. What they said during that transformation, in war conferences and private meetings, in letters and diaries and shouted arguments, reveals the slow-motion collapse of a command structure that had once conquered a continent. The Stalingrad catastrophe Zeitzler had been warning Hitler for months. The chief of the Army General Staff was a capable officer who'd earned his position through competence, not party loyalty. Throughout the autumn of 1942, he'd watched the supply situation deteriorate with mounting alarm. He'd seen intelligence reports showing massive Soviet buildup north and south of Stalingrad, forces accumulating in numbers that suggested something far more ambitious than local counterattacks. He'd calculated how many divisions Germany had in reserve versus how many the Soviets were massing. The numbers terrified him. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, with Romanian and Italian troops holding critical sectors of the flank. These Allied formations were poorly equipped, inadequately trained for the conditions they faced, and everyone in German command knew they wouldn't hold against a determined Soviet assault. In November, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus and encircled the Sixth Army, Zeitzler immediately advocated for breakout. Let them fight their way west, while they still had fuel and ammunition. Let them save what could be saved. The army was still intact, still combat effective, still capable of movement. Every day of delay would drain their strength, consume their resources, degrade their fighting capacity. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. The city bore Stalin's name. It was psychologically important. It was strategically valuable. It would be held. Hermann Göring had promised the Luftwaffe could supply them by air. The Reichsmarschall, desperate to restore his reputation after the Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, assured Hitler that German air power could deliver everything the trapped army needed. The operation would require 500 tons of supplies per day just to maintain minimal combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe, flying through deteriorating weather, contested airspace, and increasing Soviet fighter opposition, managed an average of 94 tons. On some days, they delivered nothing at all. Aircraft were shot down. Pilots were killed. Precious transport planes that Germany needed for strategic mobility were being consumed in an impossible mission. Zeitzler had known the mathematics made it impossible, but he'd learned that presenting Hitler with mathematical impossibilities only triggered rage. So he tried different arguments: strategic flexibility, preserving veteran formations, the need for mobile defense, the importance of maintaining an intact striking force for future operations. Hitler dismissed each one. The Sixth Army would hold because he ordered them to hold. Retreat was unthinkable. Surrender was impossible. The soldiers would stand and they would fight, and willpower would overcome circumstance. When Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of that army on February 2, 1943, something broke in Zeitzler. Not his loyalty, not yet, but his belief that rational argument could influence decisions. He'd been right about the supply situation, right about the encirclement danger, right about the need for withdrawal. And 300,000 men had paid for being right while being ignored. Official German losses were staggering. Over 147,000 killed and wounded, and 91,000 captured. Many of those who surrendered would never see Germany again. Only about 6,000 of the prisoners eventually returned home a decade later. In the map-room conferences that followed, Zeitzler's presentations grew sharper, more insistent. His staff noticed he'd lost weight. He was sleeping 3 hours a night, smoking constantly. His hands trembled when he pointed at maps showing Soviet advances. But Zeitzler still believed the war could be stabilized. That was the first stage of recognition, admitting you'd lost a battle while insisting you could still win the war. He advocated for mobile defense, for trading space for time, for building reserves that could counterattack Soviet breakthroughs. The intelligence picture. What made the situation truly dire was what German intelligence was reporting throughout 1943. The numbers painted a picture that became increasingly impossible to ignore. In September 1943, Zeitzler presented a comprehensive assessment of force ratios on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had numerical superiority of approximately 3-to-1 in infantry, 3-to-1 in artillery, and 2-to-1 in tanks. Germany was also fighting in Italy and defending against bombing campaigns that were destroying industrial capacity. The Soviet economy, meanwhile, was producing thousands of tanks per month. They were training hundreds of thousands of replacements. They were building artillery parks that dwarfed anything Germany could field. Hitler dismissed the assessment. Soviet equipment was inferior. Soviet tactics were crude. German soldiers were worth 3 or 4 Russians each. Therefore, the numerical advantage didn't matter. Zeitzler tried to explain that Soviet equipment had improved dramatically. The T-34 was now being produced in a version with an 85mm gun that could kill any German tank. Soviet artillery doctrine was devastatingly effective. Hitler cut him off. The problem wasn't Soviet strength. The problem was defeatist thinking among the general staff. If his generals believed in victory, they would achieve it. That was when Zeitzler began to understand that rational discussion had become impossible. You couldn't convince someone with facts when they decided facts were a conspiracy. He tried a different approach, making the tactical arguments Hitler wanted to hear while quietly implementing the strategic withdrawals Germany needed. It was exhausting, deceptive work, and it was slowly killing him. His staff watched him age a decade in a year. The confident officer who'd taken the position in September 1942 had become a haunted man who chain-smoked through conferences and sometimes had to excuse himself to vomit from stress. The production figures told their own story. Germany was manufacturing hundreds of tanks per month. The Soviets were producing thousands. German tank crews were getting fewer training hours before being sent to the front. Soviet crews were better trained than they'd been in 1941. The qualitative advantage Germany had once enjoyed was evaporating, and the quantitative disadvantage was becoming overwhelming. When Guderian examined these figures as Inspector General of Armored Troops, he knew the implications were catastrophic, but Hitler's response was always the same. Build more tanks, fight harder, believe in victory. The Kursk Gamble. The next stage of recognition came at Kursk. Operation Citadel, launched in July 1943, was supposed to be Germany's return to offensive warfare. Hitler had delayed it repeatedly, wanting more of the new Panther and Tiger tanks. The delay gave the Soviets time to build the most formidable defensive system in military history. 6 defensive belts, nearly 1 million mines, interlocking fields of fire, and reserves positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer pioneer who'd been brought back as Inspector General of Armored Troops, opposed the offensive from the start. He examined intelligence reports on Soviet preparations. He calculated the tank strength Germany could commit, 2,700 tanks and assault guns. Impressive until you realized the Soviets had more than that in reserve alone. Guderian told Hitler the attack would fail. The panzer forces needed for Citadel were required to rebuild strategic reserves. Committing them to a frontal assault against prepared defenses was exactly wrong. Hitler overruled him. The attack would proceed because Germany needed a victory to restore initiative, to convince wavering allies, to prove the Wehrmacht was still capable of offensive operations. What Germany needed and what Germany could achieve were becoming two different things. Guderian was beginning to understand that. Hitler was not. The offensive began on July 5th. Within hours, German commanders knew something was wrong. The Soviets weren't surprised. They weren't retreating in disorder. They were fighting from prepared positions with artillery support that suggested they'd known exactly where the attack was coming. The German advance measured in kilometers per day instead of tens of kilometers. Casualties mounted, tank losses climbed, and the Soviets kept feeding fresh divisions into the battle. Walter Model, commanding the northern pincer, was a tough, aggressive commander who'd earned the nickname Hitler's Fireman for his ability to stabilize crisis situations. 3 days into Citadel, he reported to Hitler that his forces were exhausted, that Soviet resistance was stronger than anticipated, that the offensive was consuming strength faster than it was gaining ground. Hitler called off Citadel on July 13th, not because of Model's assessment, because the Allies had landed in Sicily and he needed divisions for Italy. The official reason preserved the fiction that Germany had chosen to halt, not failed to break through. But the generals knew. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein would later write that Kursk marked the end of German offensive capability in the east. Guderian described it as a complete failure that handed the initiative permanently to the Soviets. Even Hitler seemed to grasp something had changed. He told Guderian after the battle, "Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over." German casualties during Operation Citadel proper, from July 5th to 20th, were between 50 and 60,000 men. But the strategic cost was far higher. The carefully rebuilt armored forces had suffered crippling losses that couldn't be quickly replaced. More importantly, the initiative had permanently passed to the Red Army. From July 1943 onward, it would be the Soviets who decided when and where to attack. Germany would react, defend, and slowly retreat. The long retreat. The summer and autumn of 1943 brought a new kind of warfare to the Eastern Front. The Soviets attacked, the Germans defended, counterattacked when possible, and then slowly retreated. It was exactly the mobile defense Manstein had advocated, but Hitler authorized it grudgingly, step by step, always too late. He'd agree to withdraw from a salient only after the forces there were nearly encircled. He'd permit a retreat only after the defensive line was already breaking. And he'd rage at his generals for abandoning ground, even when holding that ground meant losing the armies defending it. Zeitzler bore the brunt of Hitler's fury. The chief of the general staff attended daily situation conferences where Hitler would spend hours examining maps, questioning casualty figures, demanding explanations for every retreat. Zeitzler's staff noticed he developed a nervous tic, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, when Hitler began one of his monologues about willpower overcoming material disadvantage. Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, was probably the most capable operational commander Germany had. He understood maneuver warfare, how to use interior lines, how to strike at extended Soviet salients. In February and March of 1943, he executed a brilliant counteroffensive, recapturing Kharkov and stabilizing the southern front. It was the last major German victory in the East, and it convinced Hitler that the war was still winnable. That was the fundamental problem German commanders faced. Every time they achieved a tactical success, Hitler interpreted it as validation that willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantage. Manstein had stabilized the front by skillful maneuvering and by concentrating his best divisions at the decisive point. Hitler concluded that standing firm and refusing retreat was the correct strategy. The lesson Manstein tried to teach was that Germany needed to fight a different kind of war now, one based on mobility rather than holding ground. The lesson Hitler learned was that his generals succeeded when they obeyed his orders to never retreat. By January 1944, Manstein had a heated confrontation with Hitler. Army Group South was being pushed back toward the Dnieper River. Manstein wanted to conduct a fighting withdrawal to a shorter, more defensible line. Hitler insisted on holding forward positions. Manstein finally spoke bluntly. Germany didn't have enough forces to defend the current line and maintain reserves. A choice had to be made. Trade space for combat power or lose both. Hitler responded that Manstein lacked offensive spirit, that he was too willing to retreat, that the problem was mindset, not mathematics. Manstein left the meeting knowing he'd probably be relieved of command soon. He was right. By March, Hitler had replaced him with Model, who was more willing to attempt the impossible when ordered. Operation Bagration, the moment of absolute clarity. If there was a single moment when every German officer with functioning contact with reality understood that the war was irretrievably lost, it came in the summer of 1944. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive against Army Group Center, began on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. It was the most devastating defeat Germany suffered in the entire war, more catastrophic than Stalingrad, more complete than Kursk. In 5 weeks, the Soviets destroyed 28 of Army Group Center's 34 divisions. They killed or captured approximately 400,000 German soldiers, though some estimates run as high as 450,000 to 670,000 when including subsequent operations. They advanced 500 kilometers from eastern Belarus to the outskirts of Warsaw. Army Group Center essentially ceased to exist as a coherent force, and there was nothing Germany could do to stop it. The offensive caught German forces by surprise despite ample warning signs. Soviet Maskirovka, their deception operations, had convinced German high command that the main summer offensive would come in the south, toward Ukraine and Romania. As a result, panzer reserves had been positioned in the wrong sector. When the hammer blow fell on Army Group Center, there were insufficient mobile forces to contain the breakthroughs. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, had presented Hitler with withdrawal plans in May. He wanted to pull back to shorter, more defensible lines, to create reserves that could respond to Soviet offensives. Hitler rejected both proposals out of hand. Not an inch of conquered territory would be given up without a fight. Furthermore, Hitler ordered the so-called fortress cities of Belarus to be defended to the last man. When the Soviet offensive came, these isolated garrisons were quickly bypassed and destroyed. The troops that could have formed mobile reserves were instead trapped and annihilated in these fixed positions. Guderian would later call Bagration worse than Stalingrad. At least Stalingrad had been one army in one city. Bagration destroyed an entire army group across a front, hundreds of kilometers wide. The Soviets had used their full arsenal of operational art. Deep operations, simultaneous attacks across multiple axes, rapid exploitation, and partisan operations that severed German communication lines and prevented reinforcement or retreat. Soviet forces reached the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw, by early August. They were now within striking distance of Berlin itself. The destruction of Army Group Center meant the loss of 28 divisions that couldn't be replaced. It meant hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers killed or captured. It meant the loss of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. But more than the material losses, it meant the complete collapse of the German defensive line in the center. Soviet forces could now advance with minimal resistance toward the German homeland. Guderian's final struggle. Heinz Guderian became chief of the General Staff on July 21, 1944, the day after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler. The Panzer pioneer, who had revolutionized armored warfare, now faced an impossible task, defending Germany from an enemy that had learned everything the Wehrmacht once taught the world about mobile warfare and now possessed overwhelming material superiority to execute those lessons. Guderian attended these conferences with a sense of horrified fascination. He was watching a command structure collapse in real time, watching decisions being made that had no connection to military reality, watching a war being lost by a man who refused to acknowledge that losing was possible. His relationship with Hitler, which had always been contentious, deteriorated rapidly. Guderian would present casualty figures, force ratios, intelligence assessments showing Soviet offensives were inevitable and unstoppable. Hitler would accuse him of defeatism, cowardice, treachery. In January 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In 3 weeks, they advanced from Warsaw to within 60 kilometers of Berlin. They did this in the middle of winter, across terrain the Germans had assumed was impassable, with a speed that suggested the Red Army had fully mastered mobile warfare. The Wehrmacht, which had once taught the world about blitzkrieg, now watched helplessly as those same principles were used against them with devastating effect. Guderian had predicted the offensive. He'd warned Hitler it was coming. He'd begged for permission to withdraw forces from East Prussia and other exposed positions to create reserves that could counterattack. Hitler refused. The forces in East Prussia would hold. There would be no retreat. The Soviets would exhaust themselves, and then Germany would counterattack. The Vistula-Oder offensive destroyed that fantasy. Soviet forces bypassed German strongpoints, encircled resisting units, and drove west with multiple tank armies in parallel advances. German forces that could have been saved were trapped and destroyed because Hitler had forbidden withdrawal. Reserves that could have been created from those forces didn't exist, and the Red Army was now within striking distance of Berlin. On January 27th, Guderian attended a situation conference in a state of barely controlled fury. He presented the situation map showing Soviet penetrations. Hitler dismissed it as exaggerated. Guderian produced intelligence reports confirming Soviet strength. Hitler called the reports fabricated. Guderian finally lost his composure and shouted that the intelligence was accurate, that the situation was catastrophic, that Germany needed to make peace immediately before the Red Army reached Berlin. Hitler screamed back that Guderian was a traitor, that he should be shot, that his defeatist attitude was the reason Germany was losing. The two men stood face to face, both red-faced and shaking with rage, while the rest of the staff stood frozen in shock. Finally, Alfred Jodl intervened, suggesting a break in the conference. Guderian walked out, knowing his time was limited. You didn't shout at Hitler and survive long in your position. But he no longer cared. The war was lost. Berlin would fall. And the man responsible for the catastrophe was still giving orders as if willpower could stop Soviet tank armies. Guderian was relieved of his position in late March. Hitler told him to go on sick leave. It was a polite fiction. They both knew he was being dismissed for telling the truth. The psychology of continued fighting. What's remarkable about this period is how many officers in German high command knew the war was lost but continued fighting. Some fought because they feared Soviet occupation more than continued war. Some fought because they'd sworn oaths and couldn't conceive of breaking them. Some fought because stopping seemed more impossible than continuing. And some fought because admitting defeat meant acknowledging that everything they'd done, every sacrifice they'd demanded, every order they'd given had been for nothing. That psychological burden was heavier than the military situation. It was easier to keep fighting than to confront what fighting had cost. The recognition that they couldn't stop the Red Army had come to different men at different times. For Zeitzler, it had been Stalingrad. For Manstein, perhaps Kursk, or the retreat across Ukraine. For Guderian, probably Bagration. For the delusional few like Wilhelm Keitel. Maybe not until Soviet shells were falling on the Reich Chancellery. But by early 1945, every officer in German high command, with functioning contact with reality, understood that the war was over, that the Red Army would reach Berlin, that Germany would be occupied, and that everything they'd fought for was lost. What they said about this recognition varied. Some expressed it in operational terms, force ratios, supply situations, strategic assessments. Some expressed it emotionally, despair, rage, resignation. Some never expressed it directly at all, communicating their understanding only through their actions or their silence. But the words that mattered most were the ones they didn't say. The counteroffensive plans they didn't propose. The optimistic assessments they didn't deliver. The promises of victory they stopped making. The silence in the map rooms when Hitler asked when the situation would be stabilized. That silence, more than any words, revealed that German high command understood they couldn't stop the Red Army anymore. The final collapse. The final weeks brought a kind of madness to the command structure. Hitler was planning counteroffensives with armies that existed only in his imagination. He was moving divisions on maps without checking whether those divisions still existed. He was issuing orders to units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. And his staff was going through the motions of translating these fantasies into operational orders, knowing the orders would never be executed, because the units didn't exist and the situation had moved beyond any possibility of control. By April 1945, the command structure had effectively collapsed. Hitler was in the Führer bunker in Berlin, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, issuing orders to armies that couldn't receive them and wouldn't obey them if they could. Keitel and Jodl were still attending conferences, still pretending that the military situation could be managed, still maintaining the fiction that Germany was fighting a war rather than experiencing national suicide. And across what remained of German-held territory, field commanders were making their own decisions. Some fighting to the last, some seeking surrender terms, some trying to move west to surrender to the Anglo-Americans rather than the Soviets. The recognition that they couldn't stop the Red Army anymore had come to different men at different times, but the outcome was the same for all of them. The Red Army had stopped being stoppable long before German high command stopped trying to stop it. And that gap between reality and recognition, between what was true and what could be admitted, had filled with the lives of millions. German soldiers who died defending positions that couldn't be held. Soviet soldiers who died taking those positions. Civilians caught between the collapsing Wehrmacht and the advancing Red Army. The cost of that gap, of recognition delayed and truth denied, was measured in human tragedy on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The weight of recognition. Looking back from the distance of decades, the progression becomes clearer. The recognition came first to those closest to the operational reality. Zeitzler, buried in casualty reports and force ratio calculations, saw the mathematics of defeat at Stalingrad. Manstein, executing brilliant tactical operations that couldn't overcome strategic impossibility, understood after Kursk that Germany was fighting a losing war. Guderian, rebuilding armored forces with inadequate resources against an enemy that had learned to mass-produce the weapons of modern war, knew by Bagration that the end was inevitable. But recognition without the power to act is just anguish, and power without the willingness to face reality is just destruction. Hitler had the power to make decisions, but he'd lost all connection to the reality those decisions affected. His generals had clear sight of that reality, but they'd surrendered their power to influence it, one compromise and one avoided confrontation at a time. The system they'd helped create, the command structure that made every decision dependent on the will of one increasingly detached man, trapped them all in a downward spiral they couldn't escape. Zeitzler suffered a nervous breakdown in June 1944, his body and mind unable to sustain the stress of knowing what was coming while being powerless to prevent it. He disappeared from Hitler's headquarters and was eventually dismissed, his warnings proven right far too late. Manstein was removed when he finally spoke the truth Hitler didn't want to hear. Guderian, the panzer pioneer who'd helped create the Wehrmacht's doctrine of mobile warfare, spent his final months watching that doctrine used against Germany by an enemy that had become its master. He was dismissed for the crime of honest assessment, for refusing to participate in the fiction that willpower could overcome material reality. In their memoirs written after the war, these men tried to make sense of what had happened. They blamed Hitler's interference, the lack of unified command, the diversion of resources to other fronts. All true, but incomplete. They also had to admit in quieter moments that they'd enabled those decisions. They'd executed orders they knew were catastrophic. They'd continued fighting long after the war was militarily lost. The recognition that they couldn't win had come years before the surrender. But recognition without action is just despair, and despair with continued obedience is complicity. The final assessment. The question of when German command knew the Red Army was unstoppable doesn't have a single answer because it wasn't a single moment. It was a process, different for each man, stretching from February 1943 to January 1945. Some saw it immediately at Stalingrad. Others needed the shock of Kursk. Still others required the complete destruction of Bagration to accept what the numbers had been showing for years. But there was a pattern to the recognition. First came the acknowledgement of a setback, then the hope that the situation could be stabilized, then the realization that stabilization required resources Germany didn't have, then the understanding that the resource deficit was growing, not shrinking, and finally the crushing recognition that the war was unwinnable. That every day of continued fighting was just adding to the bill that would eventually come due. Alfred Jodl, who signed the surrender documents on May 7, 1945, was asked by a reporter if Germany could have won the war. Jodl paused considering the question. Then he said simply, "No, not after Stalingrad, not after Kursk, probably not after the failure to take Moscow in 1941. Germany had fought a war it couldn't win against an enemy it couldn't defeat, and the recognition of that reality had come slowly, painfully, too late to matter. The Red Army had become unstoppable sometime between the winter of 1942 and the summer of 1943, when Soviet industrial production overtook German capacity, when Soviet military doctrine evolved to match German operational art, when the numerical superiority that had always existed was finally joined with tactical and operational competence. German High Command began recognizing this reality piecemeal throughout 1943 and 1944, each man reaching his own moment of terrible clarity. But the system they served, the command structure that centralized all authority in one man's hands, meant that individual recognition changed nothing. The war continued until recognition penetrated the one mind that mattered, and by the time Hitler's fantasy finally shattered against the reality of Soviet tanks on the outskirts of Berlin, millions had paid the price for that delayed awakening. Conclusion: lessons from recognition. Delayed. The story of German command's recognition that the Red Army was unstoppable is not primarily a military story. It's a human story about the cost of truth denied, of reality rejected, of systematic suppression of unwelcome facts. The generals who saw the truth couldn't speak it to power effectively. The power that needed to hear the truth had created a system that filtered out everything but validation. The result was predictable and tragic. Men who knew better executed orders they understood were futile. Resources were wasted defending positions that couldn't be held. Lives were thrown away in counterattacks that couldn't succeed. And all because the command structure valued obedience over honesty, willpower over wisdom, and loyalty to a person over duty to reality. The gap between when the Red Army became unstoppable and when German command fully accepted that fact was filled with hundreds of thousands of lives. German soldiers who died in futile last stands. Soviet soldiers who died taking positions Germany couldn't hold. Civilians caught in the grinding machine of a war that should have ended months earlier. That's the true cost of recognition delayed, of truth denied, of systematic reality avoidance. Today, this story serves as a reminder that military prowess, tactical brilliance, and operational skill mean nothing without strategic wisdom and the courage to face unwelcome truths. The Wehrmacht had superb commanders, experienced soldiers, and sophisticated doctrine. What it lacked, fatally, was a command system that could accept reality when reality contradicted desire. That failure, more than any battlefield defeat, sealed Germany's fate. The moment German command knew the Red Army was unstoppable wasn't a moment at all. It was a progression, a gradual awakening to a truth that had been evident for anyone willing to see. Some saw it early, some saw it late. A few refused to see it until Soviet soldiers stood in the ruins of Berlin. But whenever individual commanders recognized the truth, the system they served couldn't act on that recognition. And that gap between knowledge and action, between truth and decision, between reality and policy, cost the world dearly. If you found this exploration of one of World War II's most crucial turning points compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Understanding how military organizations handle unwelcome truths remains relevant today, and there are many more stories like this one to explore. The past has lessons for the present, but only if we're willing to study them honestly. Thanks for watching.